Eli Harper and Mara Voss had planned a quiet winter retreat, far from the chaos of the city, thinking the cabin in the mountains would be a refuge. But as the first snow fell soft and sparkling in the late afternoon light, they had no idea that the storm would not just blanket the world, it would awaken something ancient, patient, and hungry, waiting just beyond the edge of the frozen forest. What began as a serene winter escape would soon become a nightmare neither of them could imagine, a terror that moved with the snow itself and left no trace of mercy. The snow started falling earlier than expected, delicate at first, dusting the edges of the world in white. I remember watching it from my cabin window, the flakes drifting lazily in the pale afternoon light, catching the last rays of sun like tiny, fragile crystals. There was a strange comfort in it, a sense that the world was softening, quieting itself under the weight of winter. I sipped my tea, feeling the warmth seep into my hands, and told myself I was safe. But as the minutes passed, the snowfall thickened, the flakes became heavier, falling faster, swirling in little whirlwinds that rose and vanished almost as quickly. The trees that framed the cabin started disappearing behind a solid wall of white, and the familiar outlines of the mountains in the distance vanished into the storm. By the time evening came, the snow had grown relentless, piling high against the cabin walls. The streetlight outside my window was barely visible through the swirling storm. I stepped to the door, shoving it open just enough to let the cold in. The wind struck me like a fist, sharp and biting, and my boots sank deep into the accumulating snow. Each step left footprints that seemed almost instantly devoured by the next wave of falling flakes, leaving no trace of where I had walked. I felt a thrill of unease at the futility of leaving any mark, as though the storm itself wanted to erase me. I wandered a few feet down the path just to see how far the snow had traveled, and then froze. My eyes caught something that didn't belong. There were footprints, just a few, faint and partially covered, but they weren't mine. They didn't match the prints I had just made. They led off toward the forest, vanishing into the thick snow, twisting in unnatural directions. My heart hammered as I tried to convince myself it must be someone else. Someone who had walked by before the storm became so heavy. Yet I had been alone all day, and the storm had started only hours ago. The wind howled, louder than before, carrying with it a sharp, bitter smell. I strained my eyes, trying to see through the white curtain. There was no one, but the prints were still there, almost as if someone had been walking in and out of reality itself. My body trembled, though I couldn't tell if it was from the cold or the fear that was beginning to coil in my chest. I wanted to step back toward the cabin, to shut the door and pretend I hadn't seen anything at all, but something inside me made me linger. I stared at the trail, tracing it with my gaze, as it twisted into the woods, fading into the storm. I thought I saw a movement, a shadow, shifting between the trees, but when I blinked there was nothing. I finally forced myself back inside, slamming the door and locking it, the wood vibrating under the sudden impact. I pressed my forehead against the cool glass of the window, trying to calm the rapid beat of my heart. Outside, the storm continued, relentless, swallowing the world in white. I poured myself another cup of tea, but my hands shook too much to enjoy it. The shadows cast by the flickering light of the lamp inside the cabin seemed alive, moving just at the edges of my vision. I told myself it was nothing, only my imagination playing tricks in the dim light. And yet, when I looked back toward the door, I froze again. In the middle of the path, just beyond the porch, the snow had formed a strange impression. It wasn't a footprint, not really. It looked like a hand pressed into the snow, fingers splayed wide, as though someone or something had reached out to touch the world beyond the cabin. The snow around it was perfectly smooth, untouched, yet the depression was sharp and deep, unnaturally so. It was too deliberate to be the wind, too defined to be an accident of nature. My stomach churned as I realized that the prints I had seen earlier, the trail into the forest, ended abruptly at this same spot. Whoever or whatever had left them had stopped there, and then disappeared completely. I wanted to look away, to force myself to ignore it, but I couldn't. My eyes stayed fixed on that sunken impression. My mind raced, imagining hands pressing through the snow, clawing their way closer, reaching for the cabin. For me, I backed away, trying to tell myself it was impossible, that it was only snow shaped by wind and gravity. Yet a deep, gnawing unease settled in my chest, and I knew instinctively that this was only the beginning. The storm outside wasn't just snow. It was waiting, watching, and somehow, it had already touched the edges of my world. The storm didn't let up. Morning came, though the world outside was barely distinguishable from night. The snow had thickened, piling higher against the cabin walls, covering the porch in a solid, gleaming mound. My footprints from the day before had vanished completely, as if the storm had erased every trace of my existence outside. The silence was overwhelming, broken only by the occasional groan of the wind as it twisted around the cabin, and the steady hiss of snow settling against the roof. I tried to convince myself to keep busy, chopping a few logs for the fire, stacking them neatly, checking the generator. But everything felt wrong. The air seemed heavier, the shadows darker, and each movement I made echoed in a way that didn't match the small, confined space of the cabin. I could feel eyes on me, though I was alone, or at least, I kept telling myself I was alone. As the day dragged on, I started noticing sounds that didn't belong. At first it was subtle, a faint scraping on the roof, barely audible over the howl of the wind. I froze each time I heard it, straining my ears. It was slow, deliberate, not the random noise of snow sliding down shingles or branches scraping. The scraping moved, shifting direction, coming closer, then fading, only to return in another part of the cabin. I lit a lantern when the generator faltered, its warm light casting long, trembling shadows across the walls. The cabin felt smaller, constricted, as if the snow and the storm outside had taken on a life of their own and were pressing inward. The creaks of the wood sounded louder now, sharper, deliberate, and the sense of being watched grew unbearable. I tried to keep my mind occupied, scanning the shelves, checking the stove, rearranging the few items I had, but the sounds persisted. The scraping moved from the roof to the porch, then along the walls, circling the cabin in a slow, methodical rhythm. It was as though something was mapping the structure, inspecting it, studying me. Every time I approached a window to look outside, the storm blurred the world into white chaos. But something about the snow didn't seem right anymore. It was too uniform, too silent, too suffocating. By nightfall, the cabin was plunged into near darkness as the generator died completely. I huddled near the fireplace, though the small flames did little to chase away the chill that had settled into my bones. The scraping began again, louder now, and I realized with a shiver that it wasn't just outside. It was coming from the corners of the cabin itself, from the spaces just beyond the light of my lantern. Something moved there, slow and deliberate, pressing against the walls, testing their boundaries. I tried to calm myself, to remind myself that it could only be the storm, the wind, some structural weakness of the cabin. But the rhythm of the sounds didn't match anything natural. It had pauses, shifts in speed, patterns that suggested intelligence, patience. My heart pounded as I remembered the hand-shaped impression in the snow from the previous night, the strange footprints that had disappeared as suddenly as they appeared. Hours or maybe minutes passed in this agonizing tension. I couldn't tell. My mind began to twist, imagining every sound as something more sinister. The wind screamed, the snow pressed against the windows, and the scraping followed me everywhere. I couldn't focus on the cabin walls without feeling a presence behind me, hovering just outside the lantern's weak circle of light. Then it stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the noise. I strained to hear, every nerve in my body taut with fear. My breath came shallow and fast. I listened as the fire crackled weakly, trying to reassure myself that I was safe, that whatever had been moving outside the cabin was gone. But just as I began to relax, a low, heavy thud echoed from the porch. Not the sound of snow falling or ice breaking, something heavy, deliberate, pressing against the wood. My stomach sank. I crept toward the window, careful not to breathe too loudly. Through the frost I could barely see the outlines of the porch, the snow piled unevenly against it. Then I noticed the strange grooves in the snow, shallow depressions as if something or someone had dragged itself along the surface. They weren't footprints. They were long, jagged lines etched in the snow with a disturbing intent, leading up to the cabin door. I stumbled back from the window, heart hammering, realizing that the scraping, the thudding, the rhythm of it all wasn't random. It was deliberate. It was stalking me, and it wasn't going to stop. By the time I managed to light a second lantern, I felt the cabin tremble, almost imperceptibly, as though the walls themselves were breathing, contracting under some unseen pressure. I couldn't tell if it was the storm or the thing outside, waiting, circling, dragging itself closer with terrifying patience. Then I saw I saw its shadow slipping past the frosted glass of the window. Not human, that much I knew instantly. Its form was elongated, distorted, shifting with the snow and the dim light. My stomach churned as I realized I was not alone, that whatever had left the hand-shaped impression and the dragged grooves was still out there, still circling, still coming closer. I backed away, gripping the lantern like a shield, but I couldn't shake the feeling that every movement I made was being watched, catalogued, waited upon. And in that suffocating storm, I understood something I couldn't escape. The snow wasn't just falling, it was alive, it was aware, and it had found me. The morning light should have brought relief, but the world outside was unrecognizable. The storm had swallowed everything, leaving nothing but an endless, blinding white. The trees, the mountains, even the familiar paths I had walked were gone, hidden beneath a thick, suffocating blanket of snow. The silence was oppressive, more complete than anything I had ever experienced. Each sound I made, my boots crunching against the packed snow near the door. The creak of the cabin floorboards felt amplified, echoing in the vast emptiness outside. I knew I had to see what had happened on the porch during the night, to understand the strange grooves I had glimpsed from the window. I forced myself to step outside, my boots sinking deep with every step, the cold gnawing through the layers of clothing I had piled on. The storm had eased slightly, but the snow was piled high, nearly up to the windowsills. I could barely see the ground beneath my feet, and the world had turned into an indistinguishable sea of white. And then I saw ether marks on the porch. They were not footprints, not the tracks of any animal I had ever known. They were long, jagged, and deliberate, etched deep into the snow as if someone had dragged themselves along the wood on their stomach. The lines twisted and curved in strange, unnatural patterns, forming something I couldn't quite recognize at first. My heart hammered in my chest, and my hands went numb as I realized the pattern was circular, spiraling in on itself, almost like a ritual. I stepped closer, hesitating at the edge of the porch. The grooves led down into the snowbank, disappearing into the white haze of the storm. Something about them was deliberate, methodical, and horrifyingly patient. Whoever or whatever had made them had not just passed by. They had stayed, circling in one place before vanishing into the storm. The thought made the hair on my arm stand on end. I wanted to retreat, to close the door and pretend I hadn't seen anything, but curiosity or perhaps fear itself kept me rooted to the spot. I stared at the pattern, trying to make sense of it. Then I noticed something even more disturbing. The circle was not complete. It had stopped abruptly, the spiral ending facing directly toward the cabin. It was as if the movement had been interrupted, frozen in mid-motion, waiting for me. My stomach turned, and I stepped back, the wind pushing against me like it wanted to knock me off balance. The cabin door groaned as I closed it behind me, and I locked it, though I doubted it would make any difference. Inside, I tried to focus on mundane tasks, stacking firewood, checking the generator, but the image of the spiral kept replaying in my mind. The sound of scraping returned, faint at first, then louder, closer. It wasn't outside anymore. I could hear it moving along the edges of the cabin, circling, creeping from corner to corner. My pulse raced. I pressed my ear to the floor, trying to pinpoint it. But the sound was everywhere and nowhere, impossible to track, impossible to ignore. I tried to light the fireplace, but the flames seemed weaker than before, as though the storm outside was drawing the warmth away from the cabin itself. The lantern flickered, casting long, distorted shadows that moved like living things across the walls. My mind raced with impossible thoughts. Was it the storm? No, it was something else, something patient, intelligent, circling, waiting. I could feel it just beyond the faint glow, just out of sight, pressing against the edges of my awareness. Hours or what felt like hours passed, each one stretching into the next with agonizing slowness. The scraping continued, never letting me rest, never allowing the illusion of safety. I thought about the hand-shaped impression in the snow from the first night and the dragged grooves on the porch, and I realized with a chill that they were connected. The same presence that had made those marks was still out there, still moving, still aware of me. By evening, the storm had intensified again, snow swirling violently around the cabin. I huddled near the fireplace, lantern in hand, staring at the walls, the floor, the windows, expecting something to appear at any moment. Then I noticed that the snow beneath the window, pressed down in a shallow, unnerving pattern. It wasn't random. It looked like fingers had pressed against the glass from outside. My breath caught in my throat. I hadn't seen anyone, but the marks were unmistakable. I stepped back, my chest tight, trying to convince myself it was a trick of the wind, of the snow settling. But the fear didn't leave. I could feel it, something watching, patient, waiting for the perfect moment. And in the back of my mind, I knew that the storm had already reached inside, had already touched the edges of my reality, and that whatever had left those marks would not be content to remain outside forever. The storm had become relentless, a suffocating presence that consumed everything beyond the cabin walls. Each day, or what felt like days, blurred into the next. The snow piling higher, heavier, until it seemed the world itself was folding in on me. I stopped keeping track of time. The sky was a constant, pale gray, the light weak and filtered, casting no shadows, giving nothing to hold on to. The silence was deceptive. Beneath it, there was movement, always movement. I tried to distract myself, stacking logs, checking the stove, shuffling the few remaining supplies I had, but the noises always returned. At first subtle, almost polite scraping, dragging the faint groan of wood under invisible weight, then louder, deliberate, as if whatever was outside had learned my routines and was testing my patience, circling the cabin with a terrible rhythm. It wasn't random, it had intent. I could feel it in the vibrations through the floorboards and the slight tremble of the walls. By the fourth night, I had stopped trying to sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined shadows moving across the edges of the lantern's weak light, forms sliding along the cabin walls just beyond perception. The scraping returned constantly, shifting from the roof to the windows, then along the floorboards, as though whatever it was had grown bold, moving closer to where I huddled near the fireplace. My breath came shallow, fogging the air, but even that warmth seemed to vanish under the weight of the storm. I kept thinking about the porch, about the grooves etched in the snow and the incomplete spiral, and a sick realization settled in my chest. This wasn't the storm. The snow, the wind, the freezing cold, they were just the instruments. Something alive was out there, patient, intelligent, learning the contours of the cabin, testing every barrier, waiting for an opportunity to cross the threshold. The thought made my skin crawl. I felt small, insignificant, a mere intruder in its domain. As the night deepened, the scraping grew closer to the windows, slow and deliberate, moving in arcs that mirrored the spiral on the porch. My mind raced. I dared not look outside, but my body betrayed my eye could see its traces in the frost. Shallow depressions forming patterns that shifted almost imperceptibly, as if the snow itself was alive. I pressed my hands against my face, trying to block it out to tell myself it was only imagination, only exhaustion, but the rhythm was too consistent, too purposeful to ignore. Then the cabin shuddered, lightly at first, and I froze, not from wind, not from the weight of snow on the roof. This was different. Something was moving inside, just beyond the firelight. I could hear it now, dragging, a slow, scraping noise coming from the corner of the room. I clutched a lantern, its weak glow trembling in my hands. My chest tightened, every instinct screamed to run, but I was trapped by the storm and by the fear itself. I forced myself to look toward the far corner, and for a moment, I thought I saw it, a shape shifting in the shadows. It was elongated, pale, impossible, with something hollow in the place of eyes. I blinked and it was gone, but the imprint remained in the snow beneath the window, a shallow, terrifying impression like a hand pressed against glass. My throat went dry. I hadn't opened the window, I hadn't been near it, yet there it was, the unmistakable mark of something reaching toward me. I stumbled back, nearly dropping the lantern. My mind spiraled with impossible thoughts. The thing outside was patient, intelligent, relentless. It had circled, dragged itself across the porch, and now it was probing, testing, learning. Every sound, every vibration, every shadow was a message, a warning. I couldn't escape, and I couldn't confront it. I could only wait and listen, and the waiting was worse than anything I could have imagined. The scraping continued, shifting from corner to corner, ceiling to floor, outside to inside, always circling, always near. I could feel it pressing in, not just on the cabin, but on me, constricting, suffocating, shaping my thoughts into fear. My eyes never left the windows, and yet I dared not see beyond the frost, for I knew that if I did, I would glimpse something no human should ever see. By dawn or what passed for dawn, the lantern flickered and died. I was plunged into darkness, alone with the storm and the presence that had insinuated itself into every corner of the cabin. The scraping stopped for a heartbeat, a long, pregnant pause, as though whatever was out there was savoring the moment, enjoying the anticipation. Then it began again, slower this time, deliberate, moving across the walls in patterns I couldn't anticipate, drawing closer with each passing second. And then I heard the unmistakable sound of something heavy pressing against the window. Small, precise taps like nails rapping on wood, followed by the faint dragging of something across the snow outside. My stomach dropped. I dared not move, my body locked in place. My mind racing with the realization that the storm had already reached inside, had already marked me as prey. I couldn't see it yet, but I knew it was there, waiting, circling, patient, and the snow outside, once pure and comforting, had become a prison, a canvas, a warning. Something was coming. I don't know how long I've been trapped in this storm. The days and nights have bled together. The world beyond my cabin reduced to a white nothingness that stretches farther than my eyes can reach. I stopped trying to track time long ago. There is no sun, no stars, only the unrelenting swirl of snow and ice. The air is thick and suffocating, each breath cold and biting, each exhale a ghost that disappears instantly into the frozen void. The scraping never stops. I can hear it in every corner of the cabin now, shifting locations unpredictably. Sometimes it comes from the roof, a slow, heavy movement. Sometimes from the floorboards beneath my feet. Sometimes from the corners of the room, just beyond the lantern's weak circle of light. I keep thinking there's more than one of them now, circling, learning, patient. I feel them pressing against the walls, against the air itself, pushing toward me, testing every barrier I've built. I no longer light the fire. The flames never seem to last, snuffed out by an unseen force. The lanterns flicker weakly, and shadows stretch across the walls in impossible angles. I don't dare move far from the center of the cabin. My stomach knots every time I hear the faintest noise, a tap, a scratch, the dragging of something heavy along the porch or across the roof. I lie awake, listening, feeling the walls themselves tremble with their presence. Last night I swore I felt the cabin shift. Not from wind, not from snow, but from something moving inside, beneath the floorboards, somewhere out of sight. The scraping began softly at first, then became a slow, deliberate rhythm, circling around me. My pulse raced as I realized the movement wasn't just around MIT, was focused on me, learning the space I occupy, calculating the shortest path, the weakest point. I held my breath, paralyzed with fear, praying I could vanish from their perception, but I knew it was futile. I finally mustered the courage to glance toward the window. Through the frost, I thought I saw a shape, pale and elongated, crouching just outside. Its features were impossible to discern, but I knew it was staring. Hollow eyes, impossibly deep, fixated on me. The snow beneath it was disturbed, churned as if the ground itself had been kneaded by its presence. I shut my eyes, refusing to look, but the image burned in my mind. When I opened them again, the snow outside had changed. The storm had vanished. The world was flat, white, endless. No trees, no mountains, no horizon, nothing but an infinite, frozen plain. My cabin stood alone like a small, fragile island in a sea of ice, and in the distance, far too far for me to reach or even comprehend, I saw movement crawling, slow, deliberate, and impossible. Something was coming toward me, and yet it did not hurry. It did not need to. The expanse of snow stretched endlessly, and it was patient. I realized then that the storm had not been a storm at all. It had been a lure, a methodical shaping of the world, designed to isolate me, to remove every trace of normalcy, until I was completely exposed and alone. The grooves in the snow, the hand-shaped impression, the scraping, all part of a pattern I could not escape, a design that had been unfolding for days without my awareness. And now, in this vast, featureless expanse, I understood the truth. I was completely vulnerable. I tried to retreat to the cabin, but the sense of being watched followed me even inside. The air itself seemed alive, pressing against my skin, moving with a weight that had no origin. I could feel it circling, learning, waiting for the moment I would falter. I sank to the floor, trembling, my mind spinning in panic. The scraping grew louder, more insistent, and I realized it was no longer just outside. It was inside the cabin, moving beneath the floorboards, through the walls, across the ceiling, everywhere and nowhere all at once. And then I saw it tore, at least I thought I did. A shadow flickered across the wall, too fast to be cast by the lantern. It shifted, elongated, impossible in shape, moving toward me in slow, deliberate arcs. My chest tightened. I wanted to scream, but no sound would come. The scraping ceased for a moment, a pause heavy with intent, as if whatever it was waiting for had finally arrived. I don't know if I'll survive this night. I don't know if I'll ever see the world as I knew it again. The storm, the snow, the silence, they were never what I thought they were. And in the distance, just beyond the cabin, I can feel it crawling closer, patient, inevitable, unstoppable. The snow is no longer snow, it is something alive. And it knows I am here.